everybody, and welcome to this session on Origin Market Statistics. My name is Rachel Reed. I head up the new insight capability that we have here at ETOA, and I'm delighted to have with me David Edwards, our resident tourism stats expert, who's going to be discussing the issues with me today. We're basing it on a document that David has written for the new Insight Hub, which you can find on our website. That's a member-only resource, a new one that's been out for a few weeks. And in a recent webinar we ran from the Insight Hub, what came out really strongly is that people want to know about the value of tourism. And of course, that's particularly relevant now, because if you're trying to understand the consequences of no tourism, you need to be able to measure what you had in the first place. And today we're going to look at origin market stats. So why is it that there's often a discrepancy between, say, when you look at the number of visitors leaving the US for Europe, why does it not match up with the numbers arriving as measured by the destinations? So David, if you can kick off on that.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and hello to you and hello to everybody watching. So let's look at the slides then that we prepared to discuss this issue. And as we've said, that the issue is that logic dictates that the number of inbound visits to destination X from origin market Y should equate to the number of outbound visits from origin market Y to destination X. But this is often not the case. So this UNWTO European Travel Commission study suggested that the number of visits from the USA to Europe in 2016 was 27 million. But US Department of Commerce figures, they suggest that the number of trips by Americans to Europe that year was a little under 13 million. So a really big difference between those two estimates, both it would seem from very bona fide sources. Why is that difference then? And which, if any, of those two alternatives should we trust? Thinking then about geography. Well, this ought not be the explanation for any discrepancies when we're dealing with an individual nation, but can play a role when analysing regional data. Europe can mean different things to different people. Now, some statistical series relate to the EU, and of course we're now very aware that the EU is in itself a bit of a moving feast. Other statistical series may relate to something called the EEA, or European Economic Area. That's the EU plus Norway, Iceland, and plucky Liechtenstein. Others may take a geographical rather than a political definition of Europe. But if you're doing that, where do you place the boundaries? Do you include Russia, Iceland, Turkey, Cyprus? It's a bit of a minefield. Who is actually being counted? Well, the man or woman in the street may have a subliminal or instinctive opinion as to what constitutes a tourist, but UNWTO actually has a definition, and here it is. A visitor, domestic, inbound or outbound, is classified as a tourist or overnight visitor if his or her trip includes an overnight stay or a same-day visitor or excursionist otherwise. So if a tourist is an overnight visitor, what then is actually a visitor? Well, again, UNWTO comes to our aid here and tells us that a visitor is a traveller taking a trip to a main destination outside his or her usual environment for less than a year for any main purpose, business, leisure, or other personal purpose, other than to be employed by a resident entity in the country or place visited. But varying definitions is not actually the main reason for our competing numbers in this regard. When estimating the number of US visits to Europe using figures collated on inbound visits, the default position is to tally data from each individual country. But helpfully, the US Department of Commerce data on outbound travel tells us that in 2018, for example, each trip made by an American to Europe involved visits to 1.6 countries, with 1 in 3 visiting more than one country on their trip to Europe. So if we multiply the US outbound estimate by 1.6, we don't quite get to the figure that the UNWTO ETC tell us, but the figures are an awful lot closer together. So the lesson here is then that you need to be highly cautious about interpreting inbound estimates from individual source markets for different world regions. Metrics collated within the origin market rather than the destination region will likely provide a more accurate figure. Many trips are not from A to B and back to A. Instead, they feature a chain of destinations, each of which will be counting their own visits, often in their own unique way, but ultimately they are all counting the same human being. So Rachel, that then takes us through a little look at the different ways there are at trying to figure out why origin visits and outbound arrivals do not always tally.
Thank you, David. One thing that just occurred to me as you were speaking is, obviously this is often done by survey data, asking people. Does that person respond? Do they ask how many are in your party? Is that part of it as well, do you think?
They do any good survey measuring the volume of visits or visitor nights will absolutely ask how many people are traveling as part of your personal party. And now, in most cases, that's fine and easy, but it can become problematic if you perhaps have a large tour group and more than one person within that tour group is interviewed. So, for example, looking at the UK approach, it's always to say within your personal traveling group rather than any wider group that you may be traveling with. But there is absolutely scope for some wriggle room there in terms of how numbers are collated and aggregated.
Yes, because one thing that occurred to me is, just throwing another curveball into the mix is, say 5 people leave the US, all 5 of them come to France, but only 2 of them go to Spain. That's another piece of double counting in some respects, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. That not everybody follows the same pattern. If you leave from one place, then you may disperse when you get to the destination. So there is an awful lot more grey than black and white in this regard. But it's always important to really look at what's being put in the footnotes and the actual definition of the measure that you're seeing on the page.
Indeed, it pays to dig deeper. Thank you very much for that, David. Do please have a look at the ETOA Insight Hub for more on this topic and lots of other topics of interest to the industry. So thank you, David,
Thank
and
you.
enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.